My name is Captain Mavis Shore, United States Air Force, and in a crowded living room thick with the humid, salty air of coastal North Carolina, my father just delivered my public sentence. The room belonged to the Reyes family. It was small, suffocatingly so, packed with the bodies and grief of a tight-knit military community in Jacksonville. This town lives and breathes the Marine Corps. The eagle, globe, and anchor emblem is more sacred here than any flag. The air was a cloying mix of cheap, percolated coffee and the bland, comforting scent of a tuna noodle casserole someone had brought over. It was the smell of tragedy in small-town America. Men in their dress blues stood with rigid posture, their wives murmuring sympathies that sounded more like practice drills than genuine comfort. And in the center of it all stood my father, retired Marine Corps Colonel Atticus Kane. A legend from Paris Island, he was a monument of starched fabric and unwavering principle, his presence sucking all the oxygen from the room. He had one hand on the trembling shoulder of Mrs. Reyes, a woman whose son, Corporal Reyes, had just been captured overseas. His voice, a low, gravelly rumble, honed by decades of barking orders, offered the standard platitudes: honor, sacrifice, the brotherhood of the Corps. I had slipped in through the back, my own Air Force dress, blues feeling like a foreign costume in this sea of scarlet and gold. I was an analyst, a creature of data and silence. Here I was an outsider. Every head turned as I entered. Every conversation died. And then my father's eyes found mine. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He let the silence hang for a moment, letting the weight of every stare press down on me. Then, looking straight through me, he spoke to the room, but his words were meant only for me. "Your spreadsheets can't stop a bullet, Mavis." The words hit me with physical force. It wasn't just a dismissal, it was a public verdict. In front of this grieving community, he had branded me as useless, my world of logic and analysis a pointless game in the face of real-world violence. Mrs. Reyes looked up at me, her face a heartbreaking canvas of confusion, her tear-filled eyes asking a question she couldn't voice. Should she thank me for trying or blame me for failing? Someone pressed a cold glass of sweet tea into my hand. The condensation dripped onto my fingers, but I couldn't bring myself to swallow. The syrupy sweetness would have choked me. But that stifling living room isn't my real world. My world is a windowless, temperature-controlled room at Pope Air Force Base, lit only by the blue-white glow of a dozen monitors. The only sound is the low, constant hum of servers processing petabytes of data from across the globe. My name is Captain Mavis Shore, but on the Global Signals Intelligence Network, I am Echo. I don't hear gunshots. I hear the digital ghosts they leave behind. I hear the silence between signals, the pregnant pause in a low-priority transmission that betrays its importance. I hear the almost imperceptible frequency shift in a drone's data link, the subtle hesitation in an encrypted voice transmission, the patterns that emerge from a billion points of chaos. My job is to listen to what isn't being said. Last month, that silence led me to the location of a hidden chemical weapons depot. My analysis, a quiet string of code sent up the chain of command, allowed a special forces team to neutralize it before it could be used on a civilian population. Hundreds of people are alive today who would otherwise be dead. There was no parade for that. No medal ceremony. Just a single encrypted email that appeared on my screen 24 hours later. It read, "Mission successful. Thanks, Echo." That is my world. A world of unseen victories and silent battles. A world my father, with his unshakable faith in steel and gunpowder, could never and would never want to understand. I sat there in the cool darkness of my office, the memory of his voice a venomous echo in my mind. My fingers, steady and sure on a keyboard, trembled slightly as I pulled open the top drawer of my desk. I bypassed the neatly organized files and regulations, my hand going to the back, to a worn, soft-covered book. The spine was cracked, the corners of the pages softened from years of being held. Daring Greatly, by Brené Brown. It was the last gift my mother gave me before the cancer took her. I could still hear her voice, thin and reedy from the hospital bed, but the steel in it was unmistakable. I'd been watching a Brené Brown talk on my laptop, and she had turned to me, a faint smile on her lips. "They won't understand you, Mavis," she had whispered, her breath smelling of antiseptic and fading hope. "They will always value the warrior in the arena with the sword, but don't you ever let the fear of judgment keep you from entering your own arena. True courage, my love, is showing up and letting yourself be seen, even when there are no guarantees. The credit belongs to the one who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood." My father's words echoed again, sharp and cruel. "Your spreadsheets can't stop a bullet." But my mother's whisper was louder. It was the anchor. It was the promise I had made to her and to myself. He could have his stage and his audience, but I had my arena, and I would not be silenced. The promise I made to my mother was tested just 2 days later. The arena I was forced into wasn't one of my choosing. It was a sterile, windowless interrogation room at the base's Office of Special Investigations, the OSI. The only color in the room came from the American flag in the corner and the polished silver of the wings on my interrogator's chest. Across the steel table sat Major Cade Jennings. He was an F-35 pilot, a golden boy with a jawline that looked like it was carved from granite and a smug, easy smile that didn't reach his eyes. His eyes were sharp, calculating like a predator assessing its prey. He represented the other side of the Air Force, the kinetic, glorious side, the pilots, the ones who got the parades. And he was looking at me like I was a malfunction in his perfect machine. He leaned back, his fingers drumming a light, arrogant rhythm on the table. Then his index finger tapped the pilot's wings pinned above his heart. A subtle, dismissive gesture. "I fly, you type." "Captain Shore," he began, his voice a smooth, confident baritone. It was the kind of voice that was used to being obeyed. "Let's cut to the chase. The access logs show your authentication code was the last one to touch the Predator drone's data stream before its command link was compromised. Corporal Reyes, he's a childhood friend of yours, isn't he?" He paused, letting the question hang in the cold, recycled air. A little hometown loyalty, perhaps? Maybe that loyalty was misplaced. He wasn't asking, he was accusing. Each word was a carefully placed brick in the wall of suspicion he was building around me. He painted a picture of a sentimental woman whose emotions overrode her duty, whose personal connection led to a catastrophic failure. It was a simple, easy narrative. It was also a complete lie. The air in the room grew thin. I felt like I was suffocating, not from a lack of oxygen, but from the sheer weight of his prejudice. I was no longer Captain Shore, an intelligence officer. I was a suspect. The official outcome was swift. I was suspended from all duties, my access to the network revoked. My credentials, the keys to my entire professional world, were deactivated. They took my badge, my lifeline. I was grounded, silenced, cut off. The organization I had sworn to serve now treated me like an enemy within its walls. I retreated to the sterile quiet of my temporary off-base apartment, the walls closing in on me. Desperation began to set in, a cold, creeping dread. That night, my encrypted phone buzzed with a single, anonymous message. 5 words, Waffle House, I-95, 2 a.m. I knew who it was from. Leo Vance, a civilian analyst in my section. He was brilliant, eccentric, and perpetually terrified of breaking any rule, no matter how small. For him to do this, it was a monumental risk. The Waffle House was an island of fluorescent light in the vast darkness of Interstate 95. It was a familiar beacon for late-night truckers and third-shift soldiers from Fort Bragg and Pope. I slid into a cracked vinyl booth, the air thick with the smell of burnt coffee, sizzling bacon, and maple syrup. Leo was already there, hunched over a plate of hash browns, looking like a nervous bird. He didn't make eye contact, he just kept his gaze fixed on his plate as I sat down. "They wiped the primary servers, Mavis," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the clatter of a spatula on the grill. "A complete data scrub. Said the file was corrupted during the breach." He risked a quick, darting glance around the restaurant before sliding a small black flash drive across the sticky tabletop, concealing the movement with a napkin. But Aegis Dynamics, their system always creates a ghost backup on a partitioned drive. It's proprietary. They don't want anyone, not even the DoD, to know it exists. Be careful, they're not just investigating you, they're building a case. He stood up abruptly, threw a $10 bill on the table, and walked out without another word, never once looking directly at me. He was afraid of being seen, of his loyalty being recorded by a security camera. I was radioactive. Back in my apartment, the only light came from the screen of my personal laptop. I slid the USB drive into its port. The file structure was a labyrinth, layers upon layers of phantom folders and mislabeled directories. Leo was right. They had buried this deep. Hours bled into one another. The city outside went quiet. I dove into the code, my mind shifting into the familiar rhythm of analysis. I wasn't just reading lines of data, I was looking for the syntax of a lie, the rhythm of a cover-up. And then I saw it. It wasn't an anomaly, it was a ghost, a parasitic string of code, elegant and vicious, embedded deep within the drone's operational software. It was designed to do one thing perfectly: mimic the authentication signature of the last authorized user. Use that signature to open a data stream and then erase its own presence, leaving the mimicked signature behind as the sole piece of evidence. This wasn't a hack from the outside. It was a backdoor, engineered and installed from within. A cold dread, far worse than anything I felt in that interrogation room, washed over me. I traced the parasite's origin signature. It came from the core encryption software itself, a program called Ironclad. Ironclad was the flagship product of Aegis Dynamics, the company where my father, Colonel Atticus Kane, served as the lead defense consultant. My heart didn't just stop. It felt like it had been ripped out of my chest. The discovery of the ghost in the machine wasn't a victory. It was the beginning of a new, more personal kind of hell. Because before I could even process the fact that my father's company was involved, the official narrative of my failure spread through the base like wildfire. Rumor is the lifeblood of any closed military community, and I was the topic of the week. The hammer fell during a mandatory base-wide security briefing in the Post Theater. I sat in the back, trying to make myself invisible, but I could feel the weight of hundreds of pairs of eyes. I could hear the whispers. Then Major Cade Jennings took the stage, his polished flight boots gleaming under the harsh lights. He wasn't there to give a briefing, he was there to hold a trial, and I was the one in the dock. He stood with a predatory stillness, his gaze sweeping the auditorium before landing, with deliberate precision, on me. As part of our ongoing investigation into the recent intelligence leak, he announced, his voice amplified by the microphone, smooth and authoritative, "We are exploring every possibility." He paused, letting the silence stretch, forcing every person in that room to follow his line of sight directly to me. That includes the possibility of human error, potentially compromised by personal sentiment. A collective, silent gasp seemed to suck the air from the room. He didn't say my name. He didn't have to. In that single calculated sentence, he had painted me as a lovesick traitor, an emotional woman who couldn't be trusted. I felt myself pinned by 1,000 invisible needles. The faces that turned to look at me were a gallery of judgment, cold curiosity, a few flickers of pity, and from most, a chilling, undisguised contempt. I was an animal in a cage, stripped bare and condemned by the very people I had sworn an oath to protect. I held my back ramrod straight, my face a mask of disciplined neutrality, while on the inside I was shattering. That night, back in the suffocating quiet of my apartment, I did the one thing I thought I could do. I called my father. Looking out my window, I watched the distant lights of the Pope Air Force Base runway, a symbol of the world I was a part of yet so utterly exiled from. I saw the powerful landing lights of a C-17 cut through the darkness. It was a world of order, power, and purpose, my world, and I was desperate for an anchor in it. I still held onto a sliver of hope that he, a colonel of the United States Marine Corps, would see the logic, the truth, that he would be my ally. He picked up on the second ring. "Dad," I started, my voice tight. "I found something. I think there's a problem with the Aegis software." I didn't get to finish. His voice cut through the line, not with the familiar gravelly warmth, but with the sharp, lethal cold of black ice. "The problem is you, Mavis," he hissed. "You and your damn virtual world. Corporal Reyes is out there, God knows where, being tortured by animals because your system failed. Do you get that? You took a United States Marine and turned him into a number on your screen, a blip on a map." His words were like shrapnel, tearing through the last of my defenses. "But Dad, it's a back door. I can prove—" "Don't call me again," he growled, the command absolute. And then he hung up. The click was sharp, final. It was followed by the flat, empty drone of the dial tone. I stood there, frozen, the phone still pressed hard against my ear, listening to the sound of nothing. That silence was more profound, more damning than any of his words. It wasn't anger, it was repudiation. He hadn't just turned his back on me, he had shoved me into the abyss and cut the rope. Have you ever felt a silence so loud it screamed? The kind of silence that comes after the one person who was supposed to save you just pushed you off the cliff? My strength gave out. The phone slipped from my numb fingers and clattered onto the cheap linoleum floor. My knees buckled, and I slid down the wall, collapsing into a heap. The tears finally came, hot and silent, tracing paths through the foundation I'd worn to the briefing. It was the crushing weight of absolute isolation. I was an enemy to my service, a failure to my community, and now a disgrace to my own father. I let myself break. I let the grief and the rage and the injustice wash over me in the darkness of that empty apartment. But as I sat there, a new feeling began to surface. Through the wreckage of my heartbreak, the hot tears began to feel cold. The sobbing subsided, replaced by a shuddering breath. The pain wasn't gone. It was crystallizing. It was hardening into something else, something cold, something sharp, something useful. Slowly, I pushed myself up. I walked on unsteady legs to my desk, my reflection a pale ghost in the dark monitor. With a deliberate click, I woke the screen. There, taped to the corner of the monitor, was a yellowed index card with a quote I'd typed out years ago. It was from a speech by Theodore Roosevelt, a quote my mother had loved. "It is not the critic who counts. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena." I whispered the last words aloud to the empty room. Whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood? I looked from the quote to the glowing lines of code on the screen. The digital trace of the ghost, the evidence, my arena. A cold, clear resolve settled over me. I wiped the last of the tears from my face. My hands were steady now. "I will prove it," I whispered, my voice no longer trembling, but filled with a quiet, dangerous certainty. Not for him, for Reyes, and for me. The cold resolve I found on my apartment floor became my armor. My grief and anger were compressed into fuel. I was suspended, locked out of the very systems I was sworn to protect, but they couldn't take my mind. They couldn't take my training. And they couldn't take away the public library. My new base of operations was the Cumberland County Public Library in downtown Fayetteville. It was a quiet, anonymous sanctuary that smelled of aging paper and floor wax. Here, surrounded by the gentle rustle of turning pages, I was just another face in the crowd, using their public Wi-Fi on a burner laptop. My father's world was one of noise, explosions, and brute force. My world was one of patterns, logic, and the profound power of silence. Here, in the quiet, I went to war. For 2 days, I stared at the lines of parasitic code Leo had given me. It was unlike anything I had ever seen. Modern malware has a certain logic, a recognizable architecture built on languages like Python or C++. This was different. It was chaotic, illogical, almost organic in its structure. It didn't follow the rules. It seemed to defy them. I kept hitting dead ends, my mind running through every known exploit, every backdoor technique in the playbook. Nothing fit. I leaned back, rubbing my tired eyes, and remembered something a military history professor at the academy once said. Every empire rots from within, not from the enemy's sword, but from its own arrogance. The creators of this code were arrogant. They believed no one would ever be smart enough to unravel their work. They didn't bother to hide it. They simply made it incomprehensible. And then, staring at a particularly convoluted string of commands, I froze. It wasn't a programming language. It was a language. The syntax wasn't based on binary logic. It was structured like an ancient agglutinative language, where complex ideas are formed by stringing together morphemes. My mind raced back 20 years to a sweltering summer I spent in a university library, voluntarily deciphering cuneiform tablets. My father had laughed himself hoarse when he found out. Sumerian? What in God's name is a Marine's daughter doing with a dead language? It's the useless hobby of a bookworm, Mavis. Useless. My fingers flew across the keyboard. I wasn't a programmer anymore. I was a linguist, a translator. I began applying the grammatical rules of ancient Sumerian to the code's structure. Subject, object, verb, postpositions instead of prepositions. The chaotic lines began to snap into place, forming a terrifying, elegant grammar. I was no longer looking at gibberish. I was reading the plan. And that's when I discovered its true purpose. The eureka moment wasn't a shout. It was a cold, sickening realization. The ghost in the machine wasn't just a backdoor to steal data. That was a secondary function. Its primary purpose was far more insidious. It was designed to create a phantom echo. The code would lie dormant until it detected a high-priority data transfer. Then it would activate, clone the credentials of the last user, initiate its own secret data transfer, and then, this was the genius of it, it would overwrite the system's primary access log with a perfectly forged record. A record that showed the legitimate user performing an illegal action. It wasn't a tool for espionage, it was a weapon of blame. A perfectly engineered scapegoat generator. This wasn't a bug, it wasn't a vulnerability, it was a feature, deliberately designed, coded, and implemented. My hands were shaking, but not from fear, from rage. I opened a secure, anonymous email client, my mind clear and focused. I addressed the message to a single recipient, General Isabella Martinez, commander of the Air Combat Command. The message contained only one line, a single explosive sentence. Aegis Ironclad wasn't breached. It was born with a key. The effect was immediate. 2,000 miles away, at Langley Air Force Base, General Martinez read my anonymous email on her secure tablet. She was a woman who had fought her way to 4 stars in a world built by and for men. She didn't get there by accepting easy answers. She summoned Major Cade Jennings to her office. He strode in, confident and smug, expecting a commendation. "Major," Martinez began, her voice calm, but with an edge of cold steel. "I want you to halt the human error angle of your investigation immediately." Jennings's smirk faltered. "General, with all due respect, the evidence against Captain Shore is conclusive." "Your evidence," she cut him off, her voice dropping, becoming dangerously quiet, "is now in question. I want you to make an official request to Aegis Dynamics. You will demand the original, uncompiled source code for the Ironclad encryption suite. We're bringing in an independent third party to audit it." He was visibly stunned, his face flushing with irritation. To him, this was an absurd waste of time, a challenge to his perfect case. "General, that's highly irregular. A civilian contractor's proprietary code." "That is an order, Major," Martinez said, her voice leaving no room for argument. "Get it done." Cade Jennings stood there, his jaw tight. For the first time, he looked uncertain. He snapped a crisp, "Yes, ma'am," turned and walked out. The swagger was gone. The seed of doubt had been planted, and I had planted it. My carefully planted seed of doubt hadn't even had time to sprout when the world caught fire. The crisis escalated from a slow-burning investigation into a full-blown inferno. It happened via a video file that bypassed all standard firewalls and landed directly in the OSI's primary communication channel. It was a message from hell. The video showed Corporal Danny Reyes. He was on his knees in a bare concrete room. His face was bruised and swollen, his uniform torn, but his eyes were clear and defiant. He was a Marine to his core. A captor held a gun to his head while another forced him to read from a prepared statement, a list of demands and threats. In the bottom corner of the screen, a digital timer appeared, its red numbers stark against the gray background. 24 kilo. The countdown had begun. In the OSI command center, I knew Cade Jennings and his team were seeing exactly what the terrorists wanted them to see. A threat, a demand, a ticking clock. But I wasn't listening to the words Reyes was being forced to say. I was listening to how he said them. As a linguist, I analyze cadence, stress, intonation. And Danny, my childhood friend, was speaking in a way I had never heard before. He was subtly altering the rhythm of his speech, placing unnatural emphasis on certain words, swapping others. He was reading Psalm 23, a passage we'd both had to memorize for Sunday school back in Jacksonville. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." But he didn't say that. He said, "The Lord is a shepherd, I shall not be wanting." A tiny change, meaningless to anyone else. To me, it was a flare in the dark. He was using a prearranged code we had joked about as kids. He was painting a picture of his prison with words. A shepherd, a single guard, be wanting, a window. He was describing the layout of the room, giving me his location's key features, one mangled Bible verse at a time. They saw a hostage. I saw an intelligence asset. My fingers flew. I compiled my analysis, the linguistic deviations, the probable meaning, the potential for a coded message, and sent it through a back channel to General Martinez's office. But I knew the truth about military bureaucracy. My report would have to be vetted, analyzed, and passed through a dozen committees. It would be debated and second-guessed. It was a process that took time, and time was the one thing Danny Reyes didn't have. The clock was ticking, 23:47:16. But I had an advantage they didn't know about: the ghost in the machine, the back door. The captors were still using the compromised communication link, confident in their encryption. They had no idea their supposedly secure channel was leaking data like a sieve. They had no idea I could hear them. I slipped on my headset, my personal laptop now my only link to the outside world. I became a ghost myself, listening to their chatter. They were nervous, agitated. They were arguing, and then I heard the words that made my blood run cold. "Move him at dawn, new location, the American witch is listening." They were spooked. They were going to move him. If they moved him, we would lose him forever. I had to act, now. This was the moment of truth. My career, my freedom, my entire future was on one side of the line. Danny's life was on the other, disobeying a direct order of suspension, accessing a classified network without authorization. It was an open and shut case for a court-martial. A dishonorable discharge, prison time. I remembered my mother's words from Brené Brown's book, no longer a comfort but a challenge. True courage is daring to fail spectacularly. I took a deep breath, and I stepped over the line. Using a cloaked access protocol I had built for myself years ago, a digital skeleton key for emergencies, I slipped back into the network. I didn't launch a counterattack. I didn't try to break their firewalls. Brute force was my father's way, not mine. I started a conversation. I began sending infinitesimally small data packets into their system, each one disguised as a common network glitch, a dropped signal, a corrupted byte. They were harmless, untraceable, but they weren't empty. Inside each packet, I embedded a payload, not a virus, but a message. My earlier analysis of their online activity had given me a psychological profile. They were from a specific rural region, deeply superstitious, with a rich folklore of vengeful spirits and angry ghosts. So I used their culture against them. The packets I sent triggered whispers in their system. The lights in their compound would flicker. A speaker would emit a burst of static that sounded for just a fraction of a second like a human whisper. I accessed local historical records, pulling the names of figures from their own ghost stories, and embedded them in the metadata of their network traffic. I wasn't trying to save Danny with a predator drone. I was trying to save him with a ghost story. I was making the demons in their own heads do my work for me, planting seeds of paranoia and fear. The clock ticked. 19:21:44. I was no longer an analyst. I was a puppeteer, pulling on the psychological strings of my enemies from half a world away, praying they would make a mistake before it was too late. My psychological warfare had backfired. Instead of making the captors cautious, my digital ghosts had made them reckless. The whispers and flickering lights I'd sent into their system didn't just spook them, it pushed them over the edge. Panicked and paranoid, they abandoned their 24-hour timeline. They decided to execute Corporal Reyes immediately, broadcasting it live as a final, defiant act of terror. The feed in the Air Operations Center at Langley switched from the recorded threat to a raw live stream. And in that instant, the simmering tension in the room boiled over into pure, unadulterated chaos. On the massive wall screen, Danny Reyes was forced to his knees. A rough black hood was yanked over his head, and the cold, dark metal of a pistol was pressed firmly to his temple. The countdown was gone, replaced by the horrific, real-time certainty of what was about to happen. The command center, the nerve center of the most powerful air force in the world, descended into a maelstrom of yelling and frantic activity. Colonels shouted orders that were immediately countermanded by other officers. Technicians, their faces bathed in the glow of their monitors, typed furiously, their efforts slamming into one digital wall after another. The signal was a phantom, bouncing between a dozen proxy servers across 3 continents. Every attempt to get a lock, to find a location, was a dead end, and in the center of it all, Major Cade Jennings stood frozen. The ace pilot, the golden boy, was a statue of impotence. His face was a pale, sickly white, his trademark confidence replaced by the slack-jawed stare of a man watching a nightmare he could not stop. He, a warrior of the sky, was completely and utterly useless. His F-35s were irrelevant. His missiles couldn't touch an enemy hidden behind a fortress of code. The room was thick with the metallic taste of failure. Hope had evaporated. Then a sound cut through the pandemonium, sharper and more definitive than any alarm. Slam. The flat of a hand striking the polished surface of the main command table. The sound cracked like a whip, and an instantaneous shocked silence fell over the room. Every head turned. Every voice died. General Isabella Martinez stood at the head of the table, an island of absolute calm in the raging sea of chaos. Her gaze was like a laser, fixed not on the terrifying image on the screen, but on the paralyzed form of Cade Jennings. "Major," she said, her voice quiet, yet it sliced through the silence with chilling precision. "Your skills are not the ones we need. Everything you were trained for is irrelevant here." Her words were not an insult, they were a fact, a brutal, clinical truth. "But I know someone whose skills are not." She turned away from Jennings, her back straight, her presence radiating an authority that bent the will of the room to her own. She faced the primary communications console and raised her voice, not shouting but projecting an order that was as clear and undeniable as a thunderclap on a clear day. "All stations, all channels, hold all traffic. Get me a priority 1. Secure patch to Captain Mavis Shore's personal line. Now." She let the order sink in, her eyes sweeping over the bewildered faces of her senior staff. Then she delivered the payload. "Find Echo. I need Echo on the line." The name landed in the room like a foreign object. Echo. The word echoed in the silence, meaningless to most, a shock to the few who knew. A wave of confusion rippled through the room as dozens of officers looked from the general to Cade Jennings, their faces a mixture of bewilderment and dawning, impossible understanding. Echo. Who the hell is Echo? Mavis Shore? The analyst? The one who was suspended? Cade Jennings looked as though the floor had vanished from beneath his feet. His mouth fell open, his face a perfect picture of disbelief and dawning humiliation. He was the critic, the judge, and he was about to witness the condemned take center stage. A young airman at the comm station, his fingers a blur on the keyboard, finally broke the spell. "Ma'am, I have her. Patching the line now. The line is secure." And then my voice. From the main speakers of the command console, a voice filled the silent, breathless room. It was calm. It was steady. It was the absolute antithesis of the panic that had gripped them only seconds before. It was the voice of someone who was already in the arena. "General, this is Echo. I'm on. Have you ever been in a situation where everything fell apart?" And then one single calm voice cut through the noise and changed everything. That's the moment they all heard. A collective sigh of disbelief and relief seemed to pass through the room. "I've been monitoring their internal comms for the last 10 minutes, I continued, my voice even and professional. My ghost story worked. They're panicking, and panic makes people sloppy. I have their exact coordinates, but General, their facility's internal network is hardened. To save him, I need you to authorize Protocol Chimera." If the name Echo had caused confusion, Chimera caused a wave of fear and awe. It was a myth, a boogeyman protocol whispered about in the darkest corners of cyber warfare doctrine. It wasn't designed to infiltrate. It was designed to annihilate. A digital scorched earth policy that could take down the entire infrastructure of an enemy, their power grid, their communications, their automated defenses. It was the weapon of last resort. And I, the disgraced captain, was asking for permission to unleash the beast. Protocol Chimera was a success. It wasn't just a success. It was a thing of brutal, simple, and overwhelming beauty. One moment, the terrorists' compound was a functioning facility. The next, it was a silent tomb of technology. The lights died, the comms went dead, the automated defenses fell silent, the live feed cut out. A Delta Force team, guided by the coordinates I had provided, went in under the cover of that sudden, total darkness. 2 hours later, the official report came through. Corporal Danny Reyes was safe, alive, and on his way home. I was the hero of the hour. My suspension was lifted. My access was restored. I was no longer a pariah, but a prodigy. The same officers who had looked at me with contempt now nodded with a newfound respect. But the victory felt hollow, incomplete. The ghost in the machine was still out there. I had treated the symptom, but the disease remained. My duty wasn't done. I spent the next 12 hours compiling my after-action report, meticulously documenting every step of the cyber operation. That's when I found it. Buried deep in the system cache of the compromised drone, a fragment of a deleted file remained. It was a single, deeply encrypted email, sent a full month before the ironclad software was deployed on our drone fleet. My blood ran cold as I decrypted the headers. It was from a lead engineer at Aegis Dynamics. It was addressed to my father, Colonel Atticus Kane. My hands trembled as I read the body of the message. The language was clinical, technical, but its meaning was terrifyingly clear. "Colonel Kane, sir, our final stress tests have revealed a potential backdoor vulnerability in the ironclad encryption suite. It's a low-probability exploit, but it exists. We recommend a full delay of deployment to patch the flaw. Please advise." I read it once, twice, a third time. The words swam before my eyes, refusing to make sense. It was impossible. He knew. He knew about the flaw. He knew there was a risk, and he signed off on the deployment anyway. The man who had looked me in the eye and accused my world of failing, of turning a Marine into a number, had knowingly fielded a system that could do exactly that. The ground beneath me, which had felt so solid just moments before, began to crack. My heart felt like it was being squeezed in a vice. I picked up my phone, my fingers moving on autopilot, dialing the number I knew by heart. This time he answered immediately. His voice, for the first time in weeks, sounded relieved, almost proud. "Mavis, I heard the news. Young Reyes is safe. A hell of a job." I cut him off. My own voice was a stranger to me, a low, trembling whisper that was somehow also as cold and sharp as a shard of glass. "Why, Dad," I asked, just that. "Why did you sign off on it?" The line went silent. It was a long, heavy silence, filled with everything he wasn't saying. I could hear his slow, deliberate breathing. He wasn't surprised. He wasn't defensive. He was just quiet. Then a long, weary sigh, like a man tired of hiding a secret. "It was a calculated risk, Mavis," he said finally, his voice devoid of any emotion. "Aegis promised me a seat on the board of directors, a significant compensation package." He paused and then delivered the killing blow. "And besides, I wanted to prove a point. I wanted to show those bookworms in the Air Force that their precious technology isn't always the answer, that it fails." The world dissolved. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't an oversight. It wasn't negligence. It was a trade, a deliberate, cold-blooded transaction. My father had weighed the life of a United States Marine, a boy he had known since birth, a boy he had mentored, a boy he called his godson, against a corporate title and a paycheck. He had risked Danny's life to win an ideological argument with a branch of the military he despised. He had gambled with another man's son to prove a petty, pathological point. The image of his face in the Reyes' living room, his hand on a grieving mother's shoulder, flashed in my mind. The hypocrisy was so monstrous, so absolute, it stole the breath from my lungs. "You knew," I whispered, the words barely audible. The first tear escaped and traced a hot path down my cheek. "You knew there was a flaw, and you did it anyway." He didn't deny it. He didn't try to justify it further. He just remained silent on the other end of the line. And his silence was the most disgusting confession of all. It was the silence of a man who had made his choice and would live with it. I pressed the button to end the call. I didn't collapse this time. I didn't shatter. The tears stopped. There was no rage, no fire, no storm. There was just a void, a vast, cold, empty space inside my chest, where, for 35 years, my love and admiration for my father had lived. It was gone, and in its place there was nothing, just the silent, echoing truth of his betrayal. Several weeks after the phone call that shattered my world, I found myself in Las Vegas. Not the glittering, neon-drenched Vegas of tourists, but the serious, purposeful Vegas of Nellis Air Force Base, home to the annual Intelligence, Surveillance, and Reconnaissance Symposium. It's a gathering of the sharpest minds in the military, the analysts, the cryptographers, the drone pilots, the strategists, my people. Yet I still felt like an outsider. I took a seat in the back row of the massive auditorium, the void inside me feeling as vast and empty as the Nevada desert outside. Down in the front row, in the seat reserved for honored guests, sat my father. He was a keynote speaker representing Aegis Dynamics, set to discuss the future of private-public partnerships in national security. The irony was a bitter pill. He was there to be celebrated for the very system that nearly cost a man his life, a betrayal only he and I knew about, or so I thought. The lights dimmed. A hush fell over the crowd. General Isabella Martinez walked to the center of the stage, her presence commanding the attention of every person in the room. "Good morning," she began, her voice crisp and clear. "We're here today to discuss the future of warfare. We'll talk about hypersonic missiles and next-generation stealth. But first, I want to talk about the most powerful weapon system we have: the human mind." A murmur of interest went through the audience. "The battles of tomorrow will not only be won by those who fly above the clouds," she continued, her eyes scanning the sea of faces, "but by those who can see through the darkness from the ground. Today we are here to honor a silent hero, an officer who proved that courage is not the absence of fear, but the refusal to surrender to it." I felt a strange prickling sensation at the back of my neck. I shifted in my seat, my heart beginning to beat a little faster. "This hero," General Martinez said, her voice rising with passion, "faced suspicion from her peers and isolation from her command. She was doubted, dismissed, and nearly broken. But she did not step back. With nothing but her intellect and a profound sense of duty, she navigated a web of lies to save the life of a United States Marine and expose a fatal flaw that threatened the safety of every single person in this room." The general paused, letting the weight of her words settle. She smiled. It was a rare, genuine smile, full of pride. "It is my distinct honor to ask you to join me in welcoming to the stage the woman we have come to know as Echo, Captain Mavis Shore." The name hit the room like a sonic boom, and then the sound of a single pair of hands clapping, which was instantly followed by another and another, until the auditorium erupted in a deafening rolling wave of applause. Hundreds of officers, analysts, and pilots, the very elite of the Air Force, were on their feet. In the middle of the crowd, I saw Major Cade Jennings. He was standing, clapping mechanically, his face flushed a deep, burning red with shame. He was applauding the woman he had tried to destroy. I was frozen, stunned. Someone next to me gently nudged my arm. "Captain, that's you." My legs felt disconnected from my body as I stood and made my way down the aisle, moving through the thunderous applause as if in a dream. I walked up the steps and onto the stage, the bright lights blinding me for a moment. I shook the general's offered hand, my mind a complete blank. And then I looked out at the crowd. My eyes scanned the front row, and I saw him, my father. He was the only person in the entire auditorium who was not standing. He sat motionless in his chair, a stone statue amidst a forest of moving figures. He looked old, smaller. The larger-than-life titan of my childhood had shrunken, his face gray and slack, under the stage lights. He just sat there watching me, his daughter, being honored by the very world he so openly despised. The world of bookworms was giving me a standing ovation, and he was forced to witness it. Our eyes met across the crowded room. I searched his face for anger, for defiance, for the familiar glint of contempt. There was none. There was only a vast, hollow emptiness. The look of a man who had just watched his entire life's philosophy, his legacy of strength and steel, crumble into dust before his very eyes. It was the face of a king who had lost his kingdom, built on a foundation of lies. And in that silent, devastating moment, he knew that I knew, and he knew that he had lost, utterly and completely. The standing ovation at Nellis was a public vindication, but the hollow space inside me remained. The truth about my father was a private burden, a silent, heavy stone I carried alone. I returned to my duties, the whispers of suspicion, replaced by murmurs of awe. But nothing had really changed inside me. The war was over, but peace felt a long way off. Then, a week later, a story broke that sent shockwaves through the entire defense industry. It wasn't a leak, it was a confession. Retired Marine Corps Colonel Atticus Kane had walked into the Pentagon and presented the Inspector General's office with a full, detailed report on the Aegis Dynamics ironclad software. He provided internal emails, testing data, and a sworn statement detailing his own role in knowingly approving the flawed system. He gave them everything they needed to prosecute not only the company, but himself. In a single, calculated act, he detonated his lucrative consulting career, obliterated his legendary reputation, and torched his future. He made himself the villain of the story, ensuring that Aegis Dynamics would be too busy fighting a federal investigation to even think about retaliating against me. It was the only truly brave thing he could have done. It was an act of penance, performed not with words of apology, but with the cold, hard currency of self-sacrifice. He did it in silence. He did it my way. I was sitting in my new, larger office at Langley when the package arrived. It was a small, unassuming cardboard box with no return address. My name and new station were written on the label in a familiar, blocky script. My hands were steady as I sliced through the packing tape. Inside, nestled in a bed of tissue paper, was a single black velvet box. There was no letter, no explanation, just the box. I opened it. Lying on a bed of worn, faded silk was his eagle globe and anchor, the EGA. It was the official insignia every Marine earns upon completing boot camp, but it's so much more than that. It's their identity, their creed, their soul, forged in metal. This one was old, the bronze finish worn smooth in places from decades of being polished, of being held. It was the one he had worn on his dress blues for 30 years. I lifted it from the box. The metal was cool and heavy in my palm. This wasn't a gift. It wasn't an apology. It was a surrender. It was a final, unconditional admission. He was relinquishing the most sacred symbol of his world and placing it in my hands. It was his way of saying that my arena, the one of silence and data, was just as valid as his of mud and blood. It was his acknowledgement that I, in my own way, was a warrior too. Beneath the velvet box, something else was tucked into the tissue paper. A faded photograph, its corners soft with age. It was me, 10 years old, a gap-toothed smile on my face, sitting on my father's broad shoulders during a 4th of July parade. He was in his full dress uniform, looking up at me, a rare, unguarded smile on his face, a moment of simple, uncomplicated love, frozen in time before our worlds diverged. I turned the photograph over. On the back, written in the shaky, spidery scrawl of an old soldier, were 6 words. You were always the better soldier. That's when the tears came. Not the hot, angry tears of betrayal, nor the shattering tears of grief. These were different. They were quiet, slow, and cleansing. This wasn't forgiveness. The scar of what he had done would always be there, a part of my history. A father had traded his honor for a board seat and gambled with the life of a boy who trusted him. That could never be erased, but this was closure. I held the photograph in one hand and the heavy, cool metal of the EGA in the other. For the first time, the two worlds felt like they could exist at the same time. The weight I had carried my entire life, the desperate need for his approval, the constant sting of his dismissal, the crushing burden of his final betrayal, finally, gently, lifted from my shoulders and floated away. The war was finally over. 6 months later, the world looks different. I'm no longer sitting in a windowless room, staring at screens and listening to silence. I'm standing at the front of a classroom, bathed in the warm, bright light of the Nevada sun, streaming through the windows. And I'm not listening anymore. I'm speaking. My new home is here, at the United States Air Force Weapons School at Nellis. This is where the best of the best come to become legends. And I'm one of their instructors. I've been tasked with creating and leading a new curriculum focused on integrated cyber warfare and signals intelligence. My students are the brightest young intelligence officers in the service, their minds sharp and eager. They don't call me Echo anymore. An echo, by its nature, only repeats what it hears. It's passive. It's a reflection of a sound that has already happened. Now they have a new name for me. They call me Signal. A signal initiates, it guides, it leads the way forward. I have taken the pain of my past, the isolation and the betrayal, and forged it into a legacy. Not a legacy of my own victories, but a legacy for those who will come after me. After my lecture one afternoon, a young captain approaches me. Her name is Diaz. She's brilliant. Her analyses are consistently sharper and more insightful than anyone else's in the class. But she carries herself with a familiar cloud of uncertainty. I see my younger self in her eyes, that same gnawing fear of not being good enough, of letting everyone down. "Ma'am," she begins, her voice hesitant, as she clutches a data slate to her chest. "I'm not sure my analysis on the last simulation is solid enough. I'm afraid I missed something. I don't want to disappoint the team." The old me would have given her a technical answer. I would have told her to rerun the diagnostics, to trust the data. But I am not the old me. I look at her, really look at her, and I don't offer platitudes. I place a hand gently on her shoulder, a gesture of support I was never given. "Captain," I say, my voice quiet but firm. Courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is stepping into the arena anyway, terrified that you're going to get your ass kicked and doing the work. Your analysis was more than solid. It was sharp. It was intuitive. Trust it. Trust yourself. She looks up, her eyes wide, and for the first time, I see a flicker of real confidence ignite within her. She nods, a small grateful smile forming on her lips. "Thank you, ma'am." As she walks away, her shoulders are a little straighter, her step a little more certain. In that moment, I understood. I was breaking the cycle. Later that day, I stood in my office, looking out at the vast, rugged expanse of the Nevada desert. The sky was a brilliant, endless blue. On my desk, 2 objects sat side by side. My father's eagle, globe, and anchor, its metal worn and scarred, rested next to my mother's dog-eared copy of Daring Greatly. For the first time, they didn't feel like symbols of 2 warring worlds. They were just my story. The steel and the vulnerability, the warrior and the scholar. They were a reminder of the entire journey. I finally understood that true strength isn't about proving other people wrong. It's about empowering other people to find the right in themselves. My father thought legacy was about the rank on your collar and the medals on your chest. He was wrong. Our legacy isn't measured by the battles we win, but by the warriors we create. It's not in the enemies we defeat, but in the allies we raise up. It's in the quiet moments when you see a spark you lit in someone else begin to burn brightly on its own. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the desert floor, I smiled. It wasn't a smile of triumph or vindication. It was a smile of peace, a smile of freedom. I was no longer an echo of anyone else's expectations or dismissals. I was a signal. And I was just getting started. My arena was a world of signals and silence. But the truth is, we all have one. It might be a boardroom, a classroom, a hospital room, or even the dinner table with your own family. It's that place where your courage is tested the most. So I want to ask you, what's your arena? Tell us about a time you had to step into it, even when you were afraid. Share your story in the comments below. We read every single one. And if stories about quiet heroes finding their voice resonate with you, make sure you subscribe to the channel and ring that notification bell. You won't want to miss the journey we take next.